Hello and welcome to The View from Mayor Brown podcast. This is a fortnightly podcast series for employment lawyers and HR practitioners which highlights developments in case law and legislative changes of importance to UK employers. It's presented by Nicholas Robertson, the head of Mayor Brown's London employment team. This podcast is available via iTunes, YouTube and the Twitter feed Nicholas Robertson, Twitter handle @NicholasRobert11. It is also now available on Spotify, Google Play and Yahoo. The time spent listening to these podcasts can count towards your continuing education requirements. And at the end of the podcast, we will explain how to get in touch if you wish to claim credit for continuing education purposes or if you have any comments or questions.
Hello and welcome to podcast number 167. I'm going to start with an apology. I am going to apologise to the person who was kind enough to write in after the last episode and say thank you very much for doing a podcast that had nothing to do with coronavirus. Well, given the importance of the coronavirus to the employment world at the moment, then I thought I can't ignore it altogether. So this episode is going to focus on the details that have now become apparent about the coronavirus job retention scheme, which has been announced by the UK government. I'm going to follow it up with one on the emergency volunteering leave allowance, which has also been announced. So that will form a package. And then hopefully, who knows, maybe we'll have some cases to report as well after that. So, let's work our way through this in a logical fashion. The government's now come up with the additional information. It's in the form of a note. It's not clear entirely whether there's going to be any legislation or anything like that. I've seen commentary that indicates there isn't going to be. So, what do we know? Well, the furlough scheme, as I think is probably the easiest way to refer to it, although its official title is the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. Who does the scheme apply to? Well, that's an easy one. The scheme applies to all employers, and any employer with employees can apply. It covers businesses, it covers charities. There's some suggestion that public sector employers are not expected to be making regular use of the scheme, but for private sector, that's not an issue. What you do, however, have to have had is a PAYE payroll scheme up and running on or before 28th February 2020 to qualify. The other point to remember about the furlough scheme, though, is if employers are going to claim under it, they need to be furloughing employees for a minimum of 3 weeks. There's no week-on, week-off arrangement here. It's a minimum of 3 weeks. Well, secondly, then, if that's the employers who can apply, which employees are covered potentially by the scheme? Any employees can be put on furlough, provided they were on the PAYE payroll on or before 28th February 2020. And thinking about this, I assume that this is some sort of anti-avoidance scheme. There are a number of people, as we'll see, who are not covered by the scheme, and I assume the idea is to avoid employers who are wanting to do the right thing, or indeed the wrong thing, putting people onto their payroll after that date, knowing that they can benefit from the furlough scheme. The note that the government's put out expressly says people can be full-time or part-time, they can be working on flexible contracts, they can be working on 0 hours contracts, and obviously that has a knock-on effect on what you can claim, but the note also addresses that. But the point is, fundamentally, those people can be covered. It does not apply to the self-employed or to workers. You've got to be being paid via PAYE. And the note specifically refers to employees in that context. Whilst on furlough, the scheme does not permit individuals to undertake revenue-generating activities or services for their employer. You can't put people onto short-time working and claim the gap back via the furlough scheme. It expressly says it does not cover individuals who are working reduced hours for reduced pay. And that does seem to be counterintuitive, and employers may well think that they want to have employees working reduced hours with reduced pay, especially if that would be covered by the furlough grant scheme, than having individuals fully unoccupied but covered by the furlough scheme itself. We've had one query where employers have already put people onto short-time working and now wish to furlough individuals. And is that what are they going to be able to claim? Our reading of the note indicates that because the key salary is the salary as at the 28th of February, and then in those circumstances you will be able to claim back 100% of, you'll be able to claim in respect of the full salary, not the reduced salary. But the point is, although it might be more economically beneficial for people to be working part-time, paid part-time, the government scheme is an all-or-nothing scheme. You can ask your employees to take online training courses, and that will not count as work for the purposes of the furlough scheme. The other point to bear in mind is it's not necessary to place all of your employees on furlough. You can have a mix of people who are working either on full-time or short-time, part-time, and others on the furlough scheme. You can use the furlough scheme as well for an individual who has already been placed on unpaid leave, provided that unpaid leave started after the 1st of March 2020. There's an element of backdating allowed. But bear in mind that individuals who are on sick leave or self-isolating in line with statutory guidance cannot be put onto the furlough scheme. They are covered by the statutory sick pay and indeed potentially company sick pay until they have fully recovered. The note also confirms, the government's note also confirms that employees are able to do voluntary work, for example, as part of the emergency volunteering scheme, without being in breach of the furlough arrangements. That's as you'd expect, given that that's not furthering the economic activities of the employer. I can see that there might be some questions if the employer is marshalling volunteers to do good works. And you hear stories in the media and so on of that sort of thing happening. But if an employer is doing that under its own name, but is doing voluntary work for the greater good, will that be viewed as being services for the employer or outside? You'd certainly hope it's outside, and therefore the employer can still claim on the basis of the furlough scheme. But I think we'll just have to see how HMRC play that one. Other point, of course, that individuals who are doing online training at home, that doesn't count as work for the purposes of the national minimum wage. So if their furlough arrangements put them below the national minimum wage, that's not an issue according to the note. So what can the employer claim? We've talked about who can claim, we've talked about who can be covered. The next thing is, what can employer claim? Well, the employer can claim a grant of up to 80% of the employer's regular wage, or up to £2,500 per month per employee, whichever is the lower. On top of this, and it's important to appreciate it's on top of it, the employer can also claim national insurance contributions and the auto-enrolment pension contributions on that subsidised wage. Bear in mind, of course, if the employer is paying 100% of salary but is able to reclaim only 80% of it, they're not going to get the national insurance or the pension contributions on top of that. As I've mentioned, the salary in question is the salary as at the 28th February 2020. Salary does not include fees, commissions and bonuses. It would seem to follow from this that cash benefits obviously are outside the scheme. Allowances that are a fixed part of the monthly salary will, I think, form part of the scheme, i.e. they can be claimed back. If you have employees whose salary is variable, perhaps reflecting the hours they work on a rota scheme, for example, they can claim, or the employer can claim back, the higher of the same month's earnings from the previous year, assuming the individual was in service with the same employer, of course, or they can claim back the average monthly earnings for the 2019 to 20 tax year. Again, presumably fees, commission, bonus, etc. are not going to be included in average monthly earnings. The note doesn't say this expressly, but I think that must follow. Our view, travel allowances which in truth are not a benefit but are there to recoup travel expenses, will not be recoverable, particularly if the individual is not actually incurring the costs of travel because the individual is on the furlough scheme and not working. How does the employer go about claiming for the grant? We understand there's going to be a portal. The government anticipates that will be up and running by the end of April. The note sets out the the requirements that will be needed to make a claim via the portal, I strongly suspect these will be supplemented when we actually see the portal in operation, but we won't see that until the end of April, as I say. But we know now that you're going to need the employer's EPAYE reference number, the number of employees being furloughed, the claim period, the amount claim, bank account number, sort code, and you're going to need a contact number and name at the employer. It's going to be up to the employer to calculate the amount of money that is to be recouped, but obviously HMRC can come in and audit things subsequently. Bear in mind, a furlough needs to last for a minimum of 3 weeks, and the employer is only entitled to make one application per employee, every 3 weeks. We think what will happen in practice is that if people are being paid monthly, the employer will be putting in an application on a monthly basis. We don't know how long it's going to take for the grant to be processed, and the application is to be made at the time that actual payroll amounts are being paid out by the employer. So it doesn't envisage employers putting in claims in advance, then banking the money and then paying it out. You can put it in advance of you can make an application in advance of an imminent payroll, whatever that is. So clearly there are going to be some questions for employers, particularly those in financial difficulties, that want to make the claim as far in advance as possible. The other point to bear in mind is that employers have to notify employees who are being furloughed in writing that they're going to be furloughed, and they need to keep a record of that written documentation. This, I think, is something that could easily be overlooked, and so we're clearly going to see standard letters that are going to be shipped out individually to employees who are being furloughed to create the necessary record. Obviously, if at the same time the employer is looking to reduce salary below 100% so that the shortfall between the furlough scheme and what they're paying the employees has been diminished, then in those circumstances too they're going to need to have a written communication unless they're going to wing it. Well, that actually brings me on nicely, in fact, to the most common question we're answering, which is, does the employer have to top up the remainder of the employee's salary, for example, because you can only claim 80% of the salary, or indeed whether the employee's normal salary exceeds £3,125 per month, and so you're going to be paying more than 20% of the salary over the furlough scheme to the employee. The original pronouncement from the government indicated that the employer was not required to top up any shortfall, but I think what the government meant by that is now much clearer. Certainly it seemed to us to be a bit odd that the scheme was going to impose some sort of unilateral variation in contract rights. I think what the government is saying is, in order to claim the grant, it's not necessary for the employee to remain on full salary. If the employee agrees to waive a top-up, for example, to avoid being made redundant, then that waiver does not take the employee outside the scope of the furlough scheme. So, one of the first questions an employer intending to operate the furlough scheme, one of the first questions they have to decide is whether it accepts that it will remain liable for the top-up, or whether it's going to reduce that gap so that the direct cost to the employer that's not covered is reduced. Bear in mind, of course, that benefits and so on will also be continuing during this period. If employers are looking to negotiate voluntary changes, then that's going to be a matter of individual consent from employees in most cases. So employers are going to have to decide what to do about those who refuse consent. Are the refuseniks at increased risk of redundancy? Does the employer enforce this unilaterally and hope that the employees don't claim back the shortfall of wages? Or does the employer give up and say, OK, I can't make this work? That in turn will have an impact on the speed with which employees can be put into the furlough scheme, and we are definitely seeing a desire by employers who are facing significant financial pressures to get this process underway as fast as possible. If employers are starting off by an identification of individuals who would otherwise be made redundant, and so the alternative contemplated by the employer to putting employees on the furlough is going to be a redundancy exercise, then that will clearly trigger collective consultation duties. given that redundancy is at least contemplated. The trouble with that is, of course, if you've got large-scale redundancies or furlough exercises, the idea of deferring the introduction of furlough for, a couple of months while you do a standard redundancy consultation exercise is pretty unattractive. Obviously, ignoring the collective consultation risk and hoping that no one sues is possible. We think some employers will go through a very fast collective consultation claim with employee representatives, particularly if they have a good relationship with the recognised union or the staff consultative body. And it may be possible to agree after one or two meetings that furlough is going to happen to avoid redundancies happening. The other thing I think we may well see is employers starting the collective consultation but furloughing individuals at the same point. That obviously would be unorthodox in a collective redundancy exercise, but here, especially if the employer is paying the employees in full and confirms that it will respect any different outcome coming out of collective consultation, there may be a limited risk to doing that. And the advantage, of course, is the employer can claim the furlough grant from as early a date as possible. Bear in mind, of course, if you're doing this and collective redundancy consultation is triggered, there's going to need to be a need to submit the HR1 form, and failing to do that is a criminal offence. One would certainly hope that the enforcement authorities are going to have other things to do with their time than worry about that, but obviously best not to commit criminal offences if one can possibly avoid it. So don't overlook that if you are doing collective consultation. It's always possible to submit a letter to the authorities saying that in practice you don't believe collective consultation has been triggered, but you're doing it out in abundance of caution, and therefore you are, of course, preserving the position, should you need to do so, to say that the HR1 form was not actually obligatory in those circumstances. We've also been asked about how employers are going to identify employees to be placed on furlough. The government note makes it clear that the usual matters, the usual obligations, unfair dismissal, discrimination, etc., will continue to apply. So obviously an employer can't furlough on a discriminatory basis, for example. But I think it goes further than that. I think for employee relations perspectives, the employer needs to be able to explain the rationale of selection for employees for the furlough process. This does not mean a full collective consultation exercise. For example, if you're putting fewer than 20 staff on furlough, then unless there have been other redundancies around the same time, collective consultation wouldn't be triggered. But we do think that it's important for employers to remember that some employees will be very worried about their future job prospects if they're being furloughed. Others may be very worried that they're not being furloughed because they've got childcare responsibilities or elder care responsibilities. So we think it's important that employers are able to articulate clearly to staff the way they are going about choosing staff to be furloughed. And we think that employers who put the time in now to explaining that will in turn be better placed, better staff relations when things hopefully go back to normal. The government note does not say that individuals must be at risk of redundancy in order to be placed on the furlough scheme itself. So in many cases we think employers will start by looking at potential headcount losses and then working out from that who goes on the furlough scheme. But it's important to emphasise that's not a necessary precondition. Employers may simply use the scheme to help them weather the storm and have no intention of shedding staff during this process or indeed at the far end. The other point to mention is that in contrast with some of the other schemes that are operating in the world, in the States, for example, there is absolutely no prohibition on making redundancies whilst other employees are being placed on furlough. In America, I understand that the grant is tied into the continuation of jobs, and so that redundancies are potentially reduce the amount of public money that you can claim. That's not directly the case here. Obviously, it is the case to the extent that if you make someone redundant, you can't claim their salary back through the furlough scheme. But there's no explicit link that says you can't make redundancies of staff if you're putting other staff on the furlough scheme. One oddity is that individuals on maternity leave seem to be capable of being put onto the furlough scheme. That's a bit odd, isn't it? The government's note does record that individuals on maternity leave are entitled to statutory pay and statutory leave and may be entitled to enhanced contractual pay. And the note says, if you offer enhanced earnings-related contractual pay to women on maternity leave, this is included as wages costs that you can claim through the scheme. Certainly seems to indicate that employers are going to be able to place women on maternity leave on furlough, but isn't that direct discrimination? I don't understand. Maybe it's just one of those things that we'll all collectively agree not to worry about. But in what circumstances wouldn't an employer want to put a woman on maternity leave on furlough and claim back any contractual enhanced contractual pay? But as I say, maybe it's just one of those things that lawyers will worry about, and out there in the real world, with lots better things to do, people will just crack on and not worry about it. So, there we have it. There are plenty of difficult questions. I would be fascinated to hear from anyone who's advising on the furlough scheme with any particularly tricky issues that they have encountered. I saw a thread on Twitter yesterday speculating that if you have a TUPE transfer after the 28th of February, you can't then put those employees on furlough because they will have been on the payroll, have only gone onto the payroll after the 1st of March. I'm sure that's not what's intended. The analysis looks horribly convincing that this is a point, understandably, the government may not have picked up on. I hope that there will be a clarification as quickly as possible, but it will be interesting to see if HMRC picks up on that. So, there we have it, the furlough scheme and the arrangements for it. Once again, my apologies to the person who was grateful that I wasn't doing stuff on the coronavirus, but I do think it's important in this time to be passing on our thoughts on this generally. So, as always, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and I will do a follow-up on the emergency volunteering leave scheme shortly, because I think that too is worth sharing. Thanks everyone for listening. Bye.
So that concludes this podcast. We hope that you find it and others in the series helpful. If you have any comments or questions or want to know how to claim continuing education credits, please email Nick at nrobertson@mayorbrown.com. Thank you for listening to the podcast.